The bitter Wyoming wind did not care about Thaddeus Galloway's nervous stomach, nor did it show any mercy to the handful of townsfolk gathered at the depot, their breath rising in synchronized plumes of white steam against the slate-gray sky. Thaddeus shifted his weight from one boot to the other, the leather creaking in the silence, and adjusted the collar of his heavy sheepskin coat, though the chill had long ago found its way into his bones. He was a man built of sharp angles and rough textures, with hands that were permanently stained by soil and oil, hands that he was currently wringing inside his pockets to hide their trembling. He had spent the last month building a picture in his mind, a fortress of expectations to protect himself from the vulnerability of what he was about to do. He had imagined a woman of sturdy stock, perhaps a widow from Ohio or a farmer's daughter from the Dakotas, someone with broad shoulders and hands as calloused as his own, someone who understood that life on the frontier was not a romance, but a negotiation with the elements. He needed a partner, not a prize. He needed someone who could help him hold the line against the encroaching winter and the loneliness that echoed through his empty ranch house like a physical weight. The infertility that had ended his first marriage and left him a solitary man at 40 was a secret he carried like a stone in his gut, and he had convinced himself that a practical arrangement was all he was entitled to, a marriage of labor, not legacy. When the stagecoach finally rattled into view, emerging from the swirling snow like a dark beetle navigating a sea of white, the conversation on the platform died instantly. Mrs. Higgins, the town's self-appointed matriarch and the woman who had helped facilitate the correspondence, stepped forward, clutching her shawl tight to her throat, her eyes bright with the promise of gossip. Thaddeus felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a dull and heavy rhythm that seemed too loud for his chest. The horses snorted, their flanks heaving with exhaustion, as the driver pulled on the reins and brought the coach to a shuddering halt in the mud and slush. Thaddeus stepped forward, his boots sinking into the muck, his eyes fixed on the door as the handle turned. He expected the sturdy widow of his imagination to descend, boots first, ready to critique the mud. Instead, the door swung open, and a silence more profound than the winter wind descended upon the crowd. The woman who stepped down was slight, almost fragile in appearance, wrapped in layers that seemed insufficient for the biting cold. She wore a gray prairie dress that looked too fine for the rugged terrain, the fabric rippling in the wind. But it was the bright red scarf wrapped intricately around her neck and head that drew every eye, a splash of violent color against the monochrome world. She was Chinese, her features delicate and set in an expression of guarded exhaustion, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the stunned townsfolk before landing, with terrifying precision, on Thaddeus. The silence stretched until it became a physical thing, a heavy blanket of judgment and confusion that smothered the platform. Mrs. Higgins let out a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth as if she had witnessed a scandal rather than an arrival. Thaddeus felt the blood rush to his face, a burning heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. He saw the way the men at the general store porch leaned forward, their eyes narrowing, exchanging glances that ranged from amusement to open hostility. This was not the sturdy partner he had ordered. This was a mistake, a clerical error, a cosmic joke played on a man who had asked for very little. The woman stood by her single modest trunk, her hands clasped in front of her, shivering slightly but holding her chin high. She looked entirely out of place, like a porcelain cup sitting on an anvil, and the absurdity of the contrast made Thaddeus feel a surge of protective instinct warring with his own embarrassment. He realized with a sinking sensation that the town was waiting for him to reject her, to send her back, to make a scene that would feed their conversations for the rest of the winter. But as he looked at her, he saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her knuckles were white from gripping her own fingers, and he recognized the terror of someone who had traveled halfway across the world only to land in a place that looked at her like a curiosity. He could not be another cruel thing in her life today. Thaddeus moved before he had fully made the decision, his long legs carrying him through the slush until he stood before her, blocking the prying eyes of the town with the breadth of his shoulders. He felt clumsy and hulking next to her, a giant made of rough-hewn timber standing beside a willow branch. He took off his hat, ignoring the snow that immediately began to settle on his hair, and cleared his throat, the sound rough and rusty. "Miss," he said, his voice lower than he intended, rumbling in his chest. "I'm Thaddeus Galloway." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, though he thought he saw a flicker of relief behind the stoicism. She nodded once, a sharp, precise movement, and reached into her sleeve to pull out a folded piece of paper, the letter of arrangement he had signed months ago. She held it out not as a greeting, but as a receipt, a proof of her right to be there. "I am Lynn," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying a lilt that sounded like music against the harsh vowels of the frontier. "I am here for the agreement." The word hung in the air, stripped of any romantic pretense, practical and cold. Mrs. Higgins bustled forward then, recovering her wits, her voice shrill. "Mr. Galloway, surely there has been a mix-up. The agency promised a woman of suitable background for the climate." Thaddeus saw Lynn's posture stiffen, her eyes fixing on the horizon as if she could will herself away. He turned to Mrs. Higgins, his face hardening into the stone mask he wore to keep the world at bay. "The lady is here, Mrs. Higgins," he said flatly, "and the weather isn't waiting." He reached down and hoisted Lynn's trunk with one hand, the muscles in his arms straining against the fabric of his coat, and nodded toward his wagon. "Let's go." The ride out to the ranch was an exercise in excruciating silence, the only sounds the rhythmic crunch of the wheels over the frozen earth and the occasional snort of the horses. Thaddeus sat rigidly on the bench, his eyes trained on the road ahead, though his peripheral vision was entirely consumed by the presence beside him. Lynn sat with her back straight, not leaning against the seat, her hands folded in her lap. The gray dress was thin, and he could see the way the wind cut through it, making her shoulders tremble in minute spasms she tried desperately to suppress. The red scarf fluttered around her face, the only vibrant thing in miles of sagebrush and snow. He felt a gnawing guilt in his gut. He had brought a heavy wool blanket, intending to drape it over the shoulders of a sturdy farm woman, but now offering it felt intimate and presumptuous. Yet the shivering was undeniable. He cleared his throat, the sound startling in the quiet, and reached behind the seat, pulling out the thick, scratchy wool. "Ma'am," he said, offering it to her without looking directly at her face. "Wind cuts sharp out here. Best cover up." Lynn looked at the blanket, then at his hands, large, scarred, holding the wool with a tentative gentleness that contradicted their appearance. She took it, her fingers brushing his glove for a fraction of a second, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. She wrapped the blanket around herself, burying her face slightly in the warmth, and for the first time Thaddeus saw her shoulders drop an inch, the tension leaking out just enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath. They rode on, two strangers bound by a piece of paper and a lack of better options, heading toward a home that Thaddeus suddenly feared was far too small to hold the weight of their combined awkwardness. The arrival at the Galloway ranch did nothing to dispel the growing knot of anxiety in Thaddeus's chest. If anything, seeing his home through the eyes of a stranger made it look shabbier, smaller, and more desolate than it ever had before. The cabin was a sturdy, low-slung structure made of weathered logs that had turned the color of iron in the dimming light, hunkered down against the wind as if trying to disappear into the landscape. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, snatched away instantly by the gusts, and the corral fences leaned slightly under the weight of accumulated snowdrifts. It was a bachelor's fortress, a place designed for sleeping and eating between hours of breaking one's back, not a home for a woman, and certainly not for a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a watercolor painting. Thaddeus pulled the wagon up to the front, the brake lever screeching a protest that echoed off the nearby barn. He jumped down, the snow crunching loudly under his boots, and moved to help her down. But Lynn was already descending, navigating the high step with a grace that made his offer of assistance look clumsy before he could even extend his hand. She landed lightly in the snow, her gray hem immediately soaking up the moisture, and looked up at the house. Her expression remained guarded, her dark eyes taking in the rough-hewn logs, the lack of a porch swing, the mud-splattered windows. Thaddeus felt the need to apologize, to explain that he hadn't had time to whitewash the timber or plant a garden, but the words stuck in his throat, feeling trivial against the vastness of the reality facing them. Inside, the cabin was warm but stark, filled with the scent of wood smoke, old coffee, and the unique musk of a life lived alone. The furniture was utilitarian, a heavy oak table, 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot in the corner that served as a sofa, and his bed in the back room separated only by a heavy curtain. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the room as Thaddeus pushed the door open, revealing the clutter of his existence. A pile of mending he'd ignored, a stack of ledgers on the table, dirty plates from breakfast still sitting near the basin. He saw Lynn's eyes sweep over the room, cataloging every detail, every speck of dust, every sign of his solitary neglect. She didn't recoil, but she didn't smile either. She simply observed, her face a mask of polite neutrality. "It ain't much," Thaddeus said, his voice echoing in the small space as he set her trunk down near the curtained partition. "It's warm, mostly. Roof holds." He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks again. I reckoned you could take the back room, for privacy. I'll sleep out here on the cot." He wanted to make it clear that he expected nothing from her, that the wife on the paper didn't mean he felt entitled to her affection, especially when he felt so unworthy of it. He watched her process this, watching for disgust or relief. Lynn looked at the curtain, then back at him, her gaze steady. "You are kind," she said softly, though the words felt formal. She walked over to the table and ran a finger along the edge, inspecting the dust, not with judgment, but with the air of someone assessing a task. "This is adequate." The word adequate stung more than he expected, a lukewarm appraisal of his life's work. But he nodded, accepting it. He busied himself with the stove, adding wood with unnecessary force, just to have something to do with his hands. "I'll get supper started," he muttered. "Beans and salt pork, unless you don't eat that." He realized too late that he knew nothing of her customs, her tastes, or her life before this moment. He was a bull in a china shop, terrified of breaking the only delicate thing he had ever invited into his world. Lynn watched him fumble with the skillet, her head tilted slightly to the side. "I can cook," she said, taking a step toward him. "It is part of the arrangement." Thaddeus shook his head quickly, stepping back as if to shield her from the drudgery. No, you've had a long travel. You rest. I've been feeding myself for 20 years. I can manage one more night." He wanted to prove his competence, to show her that while he might not be wealthy or refined, he was capable of care. But as he turned back to the stove, he knocked a tin of coffee grounds off the shelf with his elbow, sending dark granules scattering across the floorboards. The noise was startlingly loud. He froze, staring at the mess, feeling the humiliation burn his ears. Before he could move, Lynn was there, crouching down, her gray dress pooling around her, scooping the precious grounds into her small, cupped hands. "Waste not," she murmured, looking up at him. In her eyes he didn't see pity, but a quiet, terrifying patience that unnerved him more than anger ever could. The next morning broke with a sky the color of a bruised plum, the temperature dropping low enough to freeze the water in the basin solid. Thaddeus woke before dawn, his back aching from the narrow cot, driven by a frantic energy to prove his worth before Lynn even opened her eyes. He wanted the chores done, the animals fed, and the path cleared before she had to face the harshness of the day. He felt like he was on probation in his own home, auditioning for a role he wasn't sure he could play. He moved through the morning routine with a manic intensity, chopping wood with heavy, heaving swings, carrying water buckets until his shoulders screamed, ignoring the biting wind that whipped around the corner of the barn. He wanted her to wake up to a world that was managed, tamed, safe. But the harder he tried to smooth the edges of the frontier for her, the more the frontier seemed to fight back. The pump handle stuck, requiring boiling water to loosen. The chickens were skittish and refused to lay. The heavy gate to the south pasture had sagged off its top hinge, dragging in the snow like a broken limb. He was sweating despite the cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps, when he looked up toward the house and saw her. Lynn was standing at the window, the red scarf wrapped around her shoulders, watching him. She wasn't doing anything, just watching, her stillness a sharp contrast to his flailing exertion. He felt a spike of shame. He must look like a fool to her, a man fighting a losing war against his own land. Distracted by her gaze, Thaddeus turned back to the gate and yanked it hard, trying to force it into place. The wood, swollen with moisture and ice, splintered under his grip, and a jagged shard sliced across the palm of his glove, tearing the leather and biting into the skin beneath. He hissed in pain, dropping the gate, which swung back and hit him in the shin. He doubled over, cursing silently, clutching his hand. It was a small injury, the kind he ignored daily, but happening now, under her scrutiny, it felt like a catastrophic failure of competence. He squeezed his eyes shut, breathing through the throbbing in his hand, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him. He was supposed to be the provider, the protector, the man who could handle the wild. Instead, he was bleeding in the snow while his stranger wife watched from behind glass. He heard the crunch of snow behind him, not from the house, but from the road. He straightened up, wiping his glove on his trousers, and turned to see a horse and rider approaching. It was Burke, his neighbor to the east, a man whose loudness was only matched by his ambition to swallow up the smaller ranches around him. Burke was a large man, red-faced and perpetually angry, sitting high on a bay gelding that looked as mean as its owner. Thaddeus felt his stomach drop. Bert never came over for a social call, and certainly not at sunrise in this weather. Bert didn't bother dismounting. He reined his horse in just outside the fence line, the animal dancing nervously in the snow, steam blasting from its nostrils. "Galloway!" he bellowed, his voice booming across the frozen yard, shattering the morning quiet. Thaddeus walked toward the fence, keeping his injured hand tucked into his coat pocket, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "Morning, Burke," he said, keeping his voice level. "Something wrong?" Burke spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, a dark stain on the pristine white. "Wrong? I'd say so. Found 3 of your steers on my south range this morning. Mixin' with my herd. Eatin' my feed." Thaddeus frowned. "That's impossible. I checked the perimeter fence 2 days ago. It's sound." Burke laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Well, it ain't sound now. Maybe if you spent more time fixin' your wire and less time ordering fancy women from catalogs, you'd keep your stock where it belongs." The insult landed like a physical blow. Thaddeus stiffened, his jaw tightening. He knew the town was talking, but hearing it thrown in his face by Bert made the shame burn hot and bright. "Leave her out of this," Thaddeus warned, his voice dropping an octave. "If my stock is out, I'll fetch 'em. No harm done." "No harm?" Burke leaned forward over the pommel of his saddle, his face twisting into a sneer. "My bull is prize stock, Galloway. I don't need your scrub cattle bringing in sickness or messing with my lines. You get them animals out within the hour, or I shoot 'em where they stand, and you owe me for the feed." It was an unreasonable demand, a bully's tactic to assert dominance. The feed consumed in one night was negligible, and shooting stray cattle was an act of war in this valley. Thaddeus felt the trap closing around him. If he backed down, he looked weak. If he fought, he risked a feud he didn't have the manpower to win. He stood there, the cold wind biting at his exposed neck, feeling small and outnumbered even though it was just one man on a horse. He opened his mouth to try and negotiate, to plead for time, fully aware of how pathetic he sounded in his own head. But before he could speak, the front door of the cabin opened. The sound was distinct in the crisp air. Both men turned. Lynn stepped out onto the porch. She had donned a heavy coat over her dress, likely one of his old ones he had left by the door, swallowing her small frame, but the red scarf was still there, vibrant and defiant. She didn't look at Thaddeus. She looked straight at Burke, her expression calm, bordering on bored. She held something in her hand, a small, dark notebook. She walked down the steps, the snow crunching under her feet, moving not with the hesitation of a newcomer, but with the terrifying purpose of someone who has already assessed the situation and found it wanting. She stopped beside Thaddeus, barely reaching his shoulder, yet somehow occupying just as much space. She looked up at Burke, then down at the notebook, and spoke, her voice cutting through the bluster like a knife through canvas. 3 steers, she said, her English heavily accented but perfectly intelligible. Brown and white. Ear tags 14, 18, 22? Thaddeus stared at her. He hadn't even checked the tags yet. How could she possibly know which ones were missing? Burke stared at the small woman standing in the snow, his mouth hanging slightly open, the aggressive sneer faltering into a mask of pure confusion. The bay gelding shifted beneath him, sensing the sudden change in the rider's confidence, and tossed its head, the metal bit clinking sharply in the cold air. Thaddeus felt a similar shock radiating through his own limbs. He had left the ledger open on the table inside, a mess of scribbles and worries he thought were private. Yet here she was, quoting his inventory with the precision of a seasoned clerk. Lynn didn't wait for an answer. She stepped closer to the fence, the hem of her oversized coat dragging in the snow, her face tilted up toward the mounted man. "I saw the ledger," she continued, her voice steady and devoid of the trembling that Thaddeus felt in his own knees. "And I saw the tracks. The wind blew from the north last night. Your fence line at the creek bottom, the posts are rotted. I saw them when we drove past yesterday. The wire is down on your side, Mr. Burke. Our cattle did not break out. Your fence invited them in." Burke's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson, contrasting violently with the white landscape. He gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Now listen here," he sputtered, trying to regain the momentum of his anger. "I don't know how things work where you come from, little lady, but out here, a man is responsible for his stock." Lynn nodded, conceding the point with a terrifying calmness. "And a man is responsible for his perimeter," she countered. "By the county statute, which was also in the book on the table, fence maintenance on a shared boundary is a mutual obligation, but the failure of a structural post falls to the owner of the land where the post stands. The rot is on the east bank. That is your bank." She closed the small notebook with a soft thump that seemed louder than a gunshot in the silence. "We will fetch the steers. We will not pay for feed that was eaten because of your negligence. If you wish to escalate this to the sheriff, I will bring the ledger. And the piece of rotted wood I saw." Thaddeus watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and awe, as the power dynamic in the yard inverted completely. Burke looked from the small, fierce woman to Thaddeus, who was still cradling his injured hand, and back to Lynn. The bully had expected a fight with a tired, lonely man. He had not expected a deposition from a woman who looked like she could be blown away by a stiff breeze. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the fence wires. Finally, Burke let out a short, incredulous huff of air. He yanked his horse's head around, the animal rearing slightly. "You get 'em out," Burke growled, though the venom had drained out of his voice, replaced by a grudging, bewildered retreat. "I'll give you an hour. Fix the damn fence." He kicked the horse into a gallop, snow spraying up behind him as he retreated down the road, leaving the Galloways standing alone in the biting cold. Thaddeus exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 10 years. He turned to look at Lynn, really look at her, and found her trembling, not from fear, he realized now, but from the sheer adrenaline of the stand she had just taken. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, her fingers tracing the leather cover, and for the first time she looked unsure. I hope I did not overstep," she whispered, her voice losing its steel and returning to the soft lilt of the night before. "But the numbers were clear." The ride to the neighbor's pasture to retrieve the wayward steers was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the wagon the previous day. This silence was not heavy with awkwardness or judgment. It was charged with a stunned curiosity, a recalibration of the world as Thaddeus knew it. He sat on the buckboard seat, driving the team, while Lynn sat beside him, wrapped once again in the wool blanket. Every few minutes, Thaddeus would steal a glance at her profile, trying to reconcile the image of the delicate mail-order bride with the iron-spined negotiator who had just dismantled the county's biggest bully with nothing but logic and observation. His hand throbbed where the wood had sliced it, a dull ache that grounded him in reality, but the shame of the injury had been replaced by a burning question. He had thought he was bringing a dependent into his home, another mouth to feed, another life to protect from the harshness of the frontier. He had prepared himself to be the sole pillar of strength, however cracking and weathered that pillar might be. But as the wagon bumped over the frozen ruts, he realized he had been wrong. She wasn't a burden he had to carry. She was ballast. When they reached the breach in the fence, the reality of the work set in. The 3 steers were indeed mingling with Burke's herd, grazing stupidly on the winter rye. Thaddeus pulled on the brake and climbed down, wincing as his hand flexed. He expected Lynn to stay in the wagon. It was cold, muddy work, unfit for a woman in a dress, or so the code of the West dictated. But before he could even unlatch the tailgate, she was there. She had tied the hem of her dress up in a knot to keep it out of the mud, revealing practical leather boots that were clearly too big for her. His old pair, he realized with a start, which she must have found by the door. She moved toward the cattle with a low clicking sound, her arms outstretched but relaxed. Thaddeus watched, mesmerized. "They're skittish," he warned, stepping forward to intervene. "That one on the left kicks." Lynn didn't flinch. "Animals are like numbers," she said softly, not looking back. "They have a logic. You just have to find the pattern." She moved in an arc, cutting off the steer's escape route without ever making a sudden move, her presence commanding but not threatening. Thaddeus found himself falling into a rhythm with her that felt instinctively right, as if they had been working this line together for years. He handled the heavy lifting, wrestling the wire back into place and bracing the post, while she managed the livestock, her voice calm and melodic as she guided the beasts back through the gap. There was no shouting, no cursing, none of the frantic energy that usually accompanied moving cattle alone. When the last steer was back on Galloway land, Thaddeus leaned against the wagon wheel, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing temperature. He looked at Lynn, who was patting the neck of one of the horses, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold and the exertion. She looked small against the vast backdrop of the snowy plains, but she no longer looked fragile. She looked like part of the landscape, like a piece of flint revealed after the snow melts, sharp, spark-creating, and enduring. He felt a swelling in his chest that terrified him, a sudden fierce pride that he had no right to feel yet. "You handled 'em better than my best hand ever did," Thaddeus said, his voice rough. Lynn looked up, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "I grew up in a silk shop," she said, her eyes twinkling with a hint of humor. "Customers are much more difficult than cows. Cows do not haggle." That evening, the cabin felt different. The starkness that had seemed so oppressive the night before had softened, the corners filled with the golden glow of the lantern and the smell of roasting potatoes. The wind still howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside there was a new quiet, a companionable peace that settled over the room like a warm quilt. Thaddeus sat at the table, his hand freshly bandaged. Lynn had dressed it with a salve from her trunk that smelled of mint and camphor, her touch efficient and gentle, watching her move around the small kitchen. She wasn't just existing in his space anymore. She was inhabiting it. She had organized the spice jars by height, wiped down the dusty shelves, and placed the ledger back on the table, closed and squared with the edge. It was a partnership of small actions, a language of doing that Thaddeus understood far better than poetry. He realized with a pang of guilt that he had spent the last 24 hours waiting for her to fail, waiting for the moment he would have to save her, just to validate his own usefulness. "I underestimated you," Thaddeus said abruptly. The words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. Lynn stopped stirring the pot on the stove and turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned back against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "You did not know me," she answered simply. "Expectations are like a fence, Thaddeus. They keep things in, but they also keep things out. You expected fragile." Thaddeus nodded, looking down at his calloused hands. "I expected someone who needed me to be everything," he admitted, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I thought a man's worth is in what he can carry. And when I saw you, you looked so light. I thought I'd break you with the weight of this life." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "But today, you carried the weight. You carried me." Lynn walked over to the table and sat opposite him, the lantern light catching the dark depths of her eyes. She reached out and placed her hand on the table, palm up, an invitation. "I came here because I wanted a life, not a rescue," she said, her voice firm but tender. "In my village, after the floods, we learned that strength is not about being a stone that never moves. It is about being the water that finds a way. You are strong, Thaddeus. I see how you work this land alone. But you are tired." She paused, her gaze dropping to his bandaged hand. "You wanted a wife to fill the empty chair, but I think you need a partner to hold up the other side of the roof." Thaddeus felt a lump form in his throat, a painful, sweet obstruction. He had been so afraid of his own insufficiency, of the secret shame of his infertility, of being less of a man, that he hadn't realized that what he needed wasn't to be a savior, but to be seen. And she saw him, not as a failure, but as a man who was simply tired of being alone. Thaddeus hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs, before slowly reaching out to cover her hand with his own. His skin was rough, scarred from years of barbed wire and frost, contrasting sharply with the smoothness of hers. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his, a gesture of shocking intimacy that sent a jolt of warmth straight up his arm. "I have to tell you something," he began, the confession he had dreaded sitting heavy on his tongue. "Something the letters didn't say. About why there's no family here. Why it's just me." He took a breath, staring at their joined hands. I can't give you children, Lynn. The doctor said it years ago. That's why my first wife left. That's why I'm alone." He waited for the recoil, for the disappointment, for the practical calculation that this arrangement was a dead end. He braced himself for her to pull her hand away, but Lynn's grip only tightened. She looked at him, her expression softening into something profoundly gentle. "Thaddeus," she said, saying his name with a reverence he wasn't used to, "do you think I traveled across an ocean just to be a mother? I came to be a wife. I came to build a home." She squeezed his hand, anchoring him. "Children are a blessing, yes, but they are not the only harvest. We have land. We have this house. We have our hands." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. Family is not just blood. It is who stays when the winter comes. You stayed for me on that platform when everyone laughed. You stood between me and the cold. That is enough. You are enough. The words washed over him, dissolving the knot of shame that had lived in his gut for a decade. He looked at her, this woman in a gray dress with a red scarf, and saw not a stranger, but the center of his world. He realized then that romance wasn't about flowers or poetry. It was this. It was the quiet admission of flaws and the steady promise to stay anyway. It was the warmth of her hand in his, a pact made not of paper, but of shared strength. "Then we build," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We build it together." By the time the snow melted and the valley turned a vibrant, aching green, the talk in town had shifted. It happened gradually. At first, it was just whispers of how the Galloway ranch hadn't collapsed over the winter. Then it was the sight of the new fencing that ran straight and true along the creek, tight as a fiddle string. But the real change was visible when Thaddeus and Lynn came into town for supplies in late May. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, not with the stiff distance of strangers, but with the easy, leaning comfort of a team that knew each other's movements. Thaddeus looked different. His shoulders were set back, the perpetual furrow of anxiety gone from his brow, replaced by a quiet confidence. And Lynn, wearing a sturdy calico dress she had sewn herself, looked at the town, not with fear, but with the calm assurance of a woman who knew her place was earned, not given. Mrs. Higgins was sweeping the boardwalk when they pulled up. She paused, her broom hovering, ready to offer a critical remark. But then she saw Thaddeus jump down and reach for Lynn's hand, not to help her because she was weak, but simply because he wanted to hold it. She saw Lynn say something to him that made him throw his head back and laugh, a rich, deep sound that few in the town had ever heard. It was a sound of joy, of a man who had found his balance. Mrs. Higgins lowered her broom and offered a tentative nod, a silent admission of respect. Thaddeus nodded back, tipping his hat, before turning his attention entirely to his wife. They walked into the general store together, shoulders brushing, discussing the price of seed and the plans for the garden. Two people who had faced the winter and found that the spring was all the sweeter for having survived the cold together. The arrangement was gone, replaced by something far more durable, a life, built board by board, hand in hand.